You all, dear distinguished guests. We are truly excited to have you join us at this very important webinar, which is focused on the actionable steps to tackle the pressing issue of domestic health research funding shortfalls in Africa. The continent, you would agree, the continent's reliance on external donors for research and development undermines its sovereignty over critical health and research agenda. So what can be done to boost local R&D funding in Africa? This is really the question that this webinar aims to critically interrogate with very renowned speakers. My name is Cornelius Ewosho, and I'm a staff at the Steve Biko Center for Bioethics at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. On behalf of our director, Professor Kevin Behrens, I would like to express heartfelt gratitude to you, distinguished attendees, for your participation. This webinar is a key activity in a project funded by the Wellcome Trust. And I have the rare privilege of introducing the speakers and interlocutor for today's webinar to you just now. But before I introduce the speakers, let me cover some housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded, and the report will be available on an accredited platform if significant. By continuing to participate, you consent to the recording and sharing of any reports that arise from this meeting. The ethics approval number for this webinar is M25/05/26, and the approving institution is the University of Witwatersrand. Please use the Q&A feature in Zoom to pose your questions to our speakers and to the interlocutor. Please refrain from posting your questions in the chat box as I may miss them. So please use the Q&A. Some of you have registered for the CPD points. We have your information, and our project coordinator will be able to assign those points to you soon. Now to the introduction. I am particularly honored to introduce our first speaker, Professor Brando Okolo. Professor Brando Okolo is the Head of Science, Technology, and Innovation at the African Union Development Agency, Nepal. His responsibility includes overseeing the implementation of science, technology, and innovation policies across the continent. He has over 20 years in research experience in material science, hydrogen energy, and has held several roles in academia and industry, including professorships. So Professor Okolo is deeply familiar with the issues undermining Africa's sovereignty over critical health and research agendas, as well as the role local funding can play to change this narrative. As I understand, he is currently spearheading numerous high-level discussions with a diverse group of actors, including policymakers across Africa, to advance the African health security and sovereignty agenda. Professor Brandon, we really sincerely thank you for being here with us this afternoon. I also have the rare privilege to introduce to you our second speaker, Dr. Marie-Roseline Belize. Dr. Belize is an experienced diplomat and a prominent advocate for Africa's research sovereignty. Currently, Dr. Belize heads the Emergency Preparedness and Response at the World Health Organization African region. She has over 2 decades of experience in research and work across multiple continents, including Africa. I have been deeply impressed by her work on strengthening health systems in fragile contexts, as well as by her leadership during the Ebola outbreak in Africa, coordinating efforts among international organizations, national governments, and local health workers. In the last decade or so, Dr. Belize has been leading policy discussions and influencing strategies for outbreak detection, rapid response, and containment. Beyond outbreak response and containment, she's also working with a host of actors to strengthen health systems in weak contexts, ensuring they are not only reactive but also prepared for future crises. It is indeed a rare privilege to have a seasoned public health leader who is globally recognized for our work join us at this webinar. So thank you so much, Dr. Belize, for accepting our invitation. A late change we made to this webinar is the introduction of an interlocutor. Given the nature of the discussion itself, we thought it would be important to bring in a highly experienced individual who is familiar with the barriers to Africa's sovereignty agenda and will listen carefully or can listen carefully to the speakers, offer new insights or directions, and raise important questions for the speakers to consider. And we found just that person in Professor Oyewale Tomori. He is an academic of great repute, a renowned virologist, and a pioneer vice chancellor of a leading private university in Nigeria, the Redeemer University. For many years, Professor Oyewale served as the World Health Organization's African region virologist. Distinguished attendees, it is a rare honor to welcome Professor Oyewale Tomori to our gathering. His presence here today is not just an honor, it is an opportunity to hear from someone or to hear from one of the foremost leaders in African health research. So thank you so much, Prof, for being with us this afternoon. And dear attendees, here is our plan for this webinar. Our speakers will share their insights on addressing the significant shortfalls in domestic research funding on the continent, one after the other. Professor Okolo will be our first speaker, followed by Dr. Belize. They will both have 20 minutes each for their presentations. After the presentations, the interlocutor, Professor Oyewale, will share insights he has gathered from the talks and pose new questions for both our speakers and the audience. Professor Oyewale would have 10 minutes for this and will also moderate the Q&A session that follows soon afterwards before we have the closing remarks. But just before Professor Okolo speaks, we want to also take a moment to connect with you, our esteemed attendees. We want to know your background and get your views on research and development funding in Africa. This will help our panelists tailor their discussions to address your specific concerns effectively. And to facilitate this interaction, we have created only 4 engaging questions on Mentimeter. And we want to use this moment to invite you to make your voices heard by scanning the QR code on your screen or click the link in the chat box. Please take a moment to participate if you can in this Mentimeter. Your contributions are essential to making this session very impactful. So scan the QR code with your phone to attempt the questions or click the link in the chat box. Probably should take about 5 minutes to do that now before I invite Professor Okolo to speak to us. Let's see. Just want to quickly see what your responses are. So here are the questions we raised. About your background. Oh, fascinating. So we see that quite a number of people are from the academia. Fascinating. And there are people too also from the public sector. So we are getting the feedback in real time. So yes, it's fine. Please keep sending in your responses. And here is our first question. Africa can source 75% of its research and development funding locally. So a significant number of you agree, which is good. So some, oh, no, not so sure. Oh, agree again. Fascinating. Some disagree, some strongly disagree. Okay. So here is the third question we asked. Name one barrier to sourcing funding for research and development locally in Africa. See, significant number think corruption is a single and most important barrier. And there is a lack of political will, lack of prioritization. Okay. See that corruption still remains a single most important barrier to for source to funding research and development locally in Africa. Here is a final question we asked the attendee. Okay. Identify one action that could be taken to increase local research and development financing in Africa. So quite a number of people think collaboration would be important. Political commitments, accountability measures. Professor Brandon, I wonder if these responses are reflecting some way some of your own thoughts around domestic health research funding in Africa. Maybe you can just take it up from there if you can. Now I'll just stop sharing.
Yeah, I do see alignment based on the responses and what I've prepared in my intervention today.
Okay. So you can please go ahead. It's fine. I'm trying to stop sharing and I see that I can't also stop. Oh wow, okay. Yeah, you can go ahead, Prof. I would
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you. Good afternoon, all. I would like to first thank Dr. Cornelius Iwoso of the Steve Biko Center for Bioethics at Wits University for giving me the opportunity to contribute to framing an opinion on domestic health research shortfalls. I would also acknowledge my fellow panelists, Dr. Marie-Roselyn Belezaire, and our interlocutor, Professor Yewole Tomori, and of course, you distinguished audience for being here today. I will spend the next 20 minutes roughly, essentially sharing with you my opinion around research shortfalls. Allow me to begin my intervention not with diplomacy, but with data, because data is a language of urgency. As has already been indicated within the concept note for this webinar, Africa carries about 25% of the global burden of disease, yet generates less than 2% of the World Health Research output and controls less than 1% of global research funding. This is not a funding gap, it's a structural rupture. And events of the past 12 months, especially the funding cuts on health support, indeed, health support in Africa, have made it existential. According to the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, global development assistance for health declined by 21% between 2024 and 2025, driven by a staggering 67% collapse in United States financing, which represents more than $9 billion withdrawn from the global health system in a single year. Sadly, Sub-Saharan Africa has absorbed a 25% reduction in external health funds, threatening decades of hard-won progress in HIV, malaria, tuberculosis, and maternal and child health. Africa CDC has documented that official development assistance to Africa's health sector fell by 70% between 2021 and 2025. At the same time, public health emergencies on our continent surged by 41% from about 152 events in 2022 to 213 in 2024. The equation is brutally simple. Less money in, more crisis out. We're being asked to do more with catastrophically less, and the most vulnerable people in this continent will pay the price if we do not act with clarity, with ambition, and with speed. Before we demand more from the world, we must be honest about what has and what has not been done domestically. The Abuja Declaration of 2001 committed African Union member states to allocate at least 15% of national budgets to health. Roughly 25 years later, only 2 African countries, South Africa and Cabo Verde, have consistently met this target. The WHO Africa Region Health Expenditure Atlas confirms that in 2020, domestic government spending on health as a share of total government expenditure ranged from just 2.1% to about 12% across our continent. Health spending in Africa reached about $145 billion in 2022. And this figure sounds large until we recognize that it represents just 5% of Africa's GDP, and that about 80% of global health spending occurs in high-income countries. And so clearly, sub-Saharan Africa's GDP of about $2 trillion in 2024, taxed at about 15%, and with 15% allocated to health, yields a per capita health expenditure of just $37.50. Compare that with about $2,600 in Europe, and in some European countries, up to $4,000. The arithmetic tells a story of structural disadvantage that no amount of political rhetoric can gloss over. But here is what the arithmetic also tells us. The solution is not simply to spend more, it's to spend smarter, mobilize differently, and build systems that outlast any single donor's generosity. On health research specifically, the situation is even more acute. The Commission on Health Research for Development recommended in 1990, about 35 years ago, that low and middle income countries should allocate at least 2% of national health expenditures and 5% of externally funded health programs to research. The majority of African countries have not met either threshold. Between 2022 and 2024, research funding to sub-Saharan Africa declined by approximately 18%, with university research budgets stagnating even as inflation eroded purchasing power by 15 to 20% annually across several major economies. Furthermore, about 43% of grants awarded to African health research addresses only 3 diseases: HIV, tuberculosis, and malaria. This extraordinary concentration means that the full spectrum of Africa's health burden, namely non-communicable diseases, mental health, neglected tropical diseases, maternal mortality, remains chronically underfunded and under-researched. As the continental institution mandated to drive science, technology, and innovation for Africa's development, the African Union Development Agency, NEPAD, does not come today, at today's discussion, merely to describe the problem. We come with a framework, one grounded in our health research and innovation strategy for Africa that runs from 2018 to 2030 and operationalized through the Program for Investment and Financing in Africa's Health Sector, the PIFA program, endorsed in 2025 by the 38th Ordinary Session for the AU Assembly. Let me briefly outline these 5 structural pillars through which Africa can systematically close the domestic research funding gap. Pillar 1, we need to legislate the research minimum. Voluntary commitments have failed. 25 years of the Abuja Declaration should have taught us this lesson. What we now need is domestically legislated minimum allocations for health research, allocations that are binding, that are auditable, and linked to national development planning cycles. AUD and NEPAD calls on member states to enshrine in law a minimum allocation of 2% of the national health budget to health research, with dedicated ring-fenced sub-allocations for each research capacity building, for infrastructure, and critically, for researcher salaries that are competitive enough to prevent brain drain. Countries like Rwanda and South Africa and Ethiopia offer instructive models where legislation has driven sustained institutional investment. Pillar 2, we need to activate the African Health Research Fund. The concept of a continental pooled health research fund has circulated in our corridors for over a decade. The moment to implement that is now. Through PIFA and in partnership with the African Union Commission, AUD and NEPAD is advancing the architecture for a sovereign Africa Health Research Endowment, capitalized through assessed contributions from member states, innovative domestic finance instruments, such as health research levies and diaspora bonds, and catalytic co-investment from the African Development Bank and private sector partners. Such a fund must be professionally managed, independently governed, and structured to finance multi-year research programs rather than fragmented project grants, because scientific excellence requires institutional continuity and not annual uncertainty. Pillar 3, to mobilize private sector and philanthropic capital. Africa's private health sector is growing at pace. The continent's pharmaceutical market alone is projected to reach 65 billion US dollars by 2030. The technology sector is generating extraordinary innovation, from mobile diagnostics to AI-driven disease surveillance. Yet, private investment in health research remains negligible relative to sector scale. AUD and NEPAD's Homegrown Solutions Accelerator, now in its 5th cohort, is building the pipeline of research-driven health ventures that can attract private capital, but we must go further. We need fiscal incentives. We need tax credits for research investments. We need public, private, and people research partnerships with clear IP sharing frameworks and innovation procurement policies that create market demand for Africa-developed health technologies. In September 2024, the BOMA at the United Nations General Assembly convening demonstrated what is possible when we bring heads of states, venture capitalists, scientists, and health system leaders into the same room with a clear investment thesis. This is the model we must scale. Pillar 4, we need to digitize and democratize research infrastructure. Physical research infrastructure is expensive to build and costly to maintain. Digital and distributed models are not. Africa has proven this in mobile banking, in digital identity, and in telehealth. We must now prove it in research. Through STISA 2034, STISA stands for the Science, Technology, and Innovation Strategy for Africa. AUD and NEPAD seeks to advance a continental digital research infrastructure strategy that includes open access, health data repositories, shared biobank protocols, federated AI analytics platforms, and virtual clinical trial networks. These approaches compress the cost of research dramatically while expanding participation to institutions and researchers currently locked out of the system. The 5th pillar, we need to restructure aid relationships around research sovereignty. Development assistance for health will not disappear entirely, but its geography, its terms, and its conditionalities must fundamentally change. Africa must move from being a site of research to being the architect of its own research agenda. This means insisting on principal investigator parity, on overhead recovery that builds institutional capacity, and on IP arrangements that vest in Africa's institutions. AUD and NEPAD's Health Research and Innovation Research explicitly calls for frameworks governing South-South collaboration, equitable North-South research partnerships, and intellectual property arrangements that serve public health rather than commercial extraction. The European and developing countries' clinical trial partnership model offers a useful, it might be imperfect, but it's a template that we should adapt. We should Africanize it and we should own it. Now, I will not pretend that the crisis we face is without costs. The US aid cuts alone are projected to contribute about 50 million additional AIDS deaths and almost 8 million child deaths between now and 2040 if trends are not reversed. The human stakes could not be any higher. But I believe that crisis compresses timelines. What was politically difficult yesterday becomes strategically necessary today. Africa now has the political mandate and the institutional architecture and the technological tools to build a domestically anchored research ecosystem, and we should choose to act now. Consider what has already changed. In 2021, the COVID-19 pandemic demonstrated that Africa can manufacture, that Africa can research, and that Africa can regulate health technologies at pace when the political will exists. The African Medicines Agency, AMA, now operational, as you know, is also a product of AUD and NEPAD. It provides the regulatory architecture that was absent a decade ago. The African Continental Free Trade Area creates a unified market that can justify investment in African health products at continental scale. The AU High-Level Panel on Emerging Technologies, co-convened by AUD and NEPAD, is embedding AI, genomics, and digital health into our continental science agenda. Research funding to East Africa has declined, but researchers in Kenya, in Uganda, in Tanzania, in Rwanda, and in Ethiopia have responded with resilient, self-sustaining models, namely community-embedded research, South-South knowledge exchange, methodological innovation that reduces cost without sacrificing scientific rigor. These are not coping mechanisms. These are the green shoots of an African research paradigm that is not dependent on the mere generosity of others. What we now need is more reports. It's not more reports or more frameworks. We have those. What we need is political courage at the national level, institutional courage at the continental level, and financial commitment from every actor in this continent. Let me close with specificity, because specificity is what distinguishes a commitment from a conversation. AUD and NEPAD calls on colleagues on this webinar and those that are not present here to endorse the following actions. Member states should table domestic legislation within 24 months mandating a minimum 2% of national health expenditure for health research with independent audit and public reporting requirements. The African Union Commission and AUD and NEPAD should finalize within 12 months the capitalization framework for a continental African health research endowment with an initial target of at least 500 million US dollars over 5 years. Finance ministers should also be engaged in this process, not just health ministers, because health research is an economic investment with measurable GDP returns. It's not a humanitarian expenditure. Private sector actors should commit to PIFA investment compacts, co-investing in research infrastructure, clinical trial capacity, and health data systems in return for clearly defined IP incentives. We should keep in mind that development partners should restructure existing health research grants over a 5-year transition to principal investigator parity, overhead costs recovery at no less than 30%, and IP terms that vest in African institutions. Colleagues, Africa spends $37.50 per capita on health. Europe spends about 2,600 US dollars. That gap will not close through goodwill, and that's a fact. It will close through structural reform, through domestic resource mobilization, through institutional discipline, and yes, through advocacy. Advocacy that makes the economic and moral case for African health research with the clarity and the force it deserves. As a matter of fact, one of the measures of our generation's leadership will not be by the eloquence of our declarations. It will be the resilience of the health systems and research ecosystems we leave behind. The time to build them on our own terms with our own resources is now. On behalf of health professionals who give the work in this continent some meaning, I say thank you.
And thank you indeed, Prof. I think that was such a very honest, but at the same time, useful and insightful recommendation that you provided towards the end of that presentation. And what I really find really important and striking in that presentation is that you not only sincerely and honestly describe the state of health research and development in Africa. I mean, the substantial part of sourcing of funding for that for health for research and development in Africa is sourced externally. But I also like the fact that you articulated very key steps, tangible steps that you think we could take to change that narrative. You talked about legislating research minimum, which I thought was very useful because it refers to a very practical step that could be taken, and the 2% to a dedicated fund that you mentioned. Research fund implementation that you also mentioned, mobilizing private sectors. Even though I would have loved to hear more about how to really mobilize the private sector and how to mobilize the private sector and whether we would not also overwhelm them because they have already been mobilized for a number of other things. But you also talked about digitizing and democratizing research infrastructure, which I also thought was very important. But I'm also, maybe during the Q&A, I'll be very curious to learn how your ideas about how we could address, for example, important issues around interoperability and the personnel capacity that certain nations or member states may suffer from. But thank you so much, Prof, for the very honest conversation and the presentation, and for your recommendations that yes, there is need for us to have structural reforms, there is need for us to mobilize domestic funds, and there is also need for us to advocate for health and for research and development in Africa. I mean, in order to change this narrative. So thank you really for this. May I now invite Dr. Marie-Roselyn, please, and just for our attendees, please. So Professor Brando didn't share or didn't use PowerPoints. He spoke directly to the issue. But I would invite Dr. Marie-Roselyn now, Belize. I mean, if she's also going to share, but she's also certainly free to share. Dr. Marie, can you hear me? You're on mute if you are saying something. So I can see your screen, Dr. Marie, but you're still on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you now. So you can.
Okay,
I can
apologies
hear you
because
now.
of
All right.
because of the bandwidth.
Okay.
So good afternoon to my fellow panelists.
Dr. Marie, may I ask you to put the PowerPoint in presentation mode?
Okay.
Excellent. So please go ahead. Yes.
Okay. Good afternoon to my fellow panelists, partners, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. It is a privilege to participate in this discussion and to contribute to this critical topic, how Africa can address persistent shortfalls in domestic health research funding. This issue goes to the heart of health sovereignty and resilience on the continent. Now, if we step back and look at the global health research and development, the picture is quite clear. Between 2015 and 2024, around $86 billion were invested globally, but that investment has been uneven and largely driven by donor priorities, with more than 70% focused on HIV, TB, and malaria. At the same time, Africa presents 19% of the global population, reports the majority of epidemic events, yet contributes only 2% of global health knowledge. And roughly 90% of research and development funding still remains externally driven. So the issue is not simply how much is invested, it's about imbalance and ultimately who defines priorities and who benefits from that investment. The reasons behind this, as you can see from this slide, are well understood, but they are interconnected. We see low domestic investment, infrastructure gaps, and workforce limitations. We also see system inefficiencies, weak research ecosystems, limited incentives, and continued brain drain. And importantly, governance challenges where dependence continues to shape research priorities and where policy does not always translate into implementation. So this is not a single constraint, it's a whole systems issue. So let's discuss why commitments have not yet been delivered. We have had strong political commitments over time, but they have not translated into sustained change. Many of these commitments are non-binding and lack accountability. They focus on targets rather than building financing systems. They operate within short political cycles, while research and development requires long-term investment, and governance remains fragmented. So the issue is not commitment, it is the absence of systems that can deliver on those commitments. And I will give a case example of Mpox. Mpox is a useful example of how this plays out in practice. There was already data available from other settings supporting safety and effectiveness, but regulators appropriately required evidence relevant to Africa populations. At the same time, countries were cautious and in many cases slow to move on generating that evidence, whether in younger populations or through dose-sparing strategies. And a key constraint was just not technical, it was financing, readiness, and the ability to move quickly. So the issue was not a lack of data globally, it was that we were not positioned to generate use local evidence fast enough. And that comes back to alignment between research priorities, financing, regulatory pathways, and implementation capacity. So financing, the big question, is 75% of R&D financing achievable? This brings us to financing. Can we finance? Yes, but not within the current system. At present, financing is short-term, fragmented, and largely external. That makes it difficult to sustain research and even more difficult to respond quickly when priorities shift. What we need is predictable, protected financing. And what does this mean? This entirely means that we need to embed R&D into national budgets and mid-term frameworks and establishing multi-year funding mechanisms. So in a nutshell, R&D needs to function more like public infrastructure rather than a project. So how do we strengthen the ecosystem? Because financing alone is not enough, we need to strengthen the whole ecosystem. This includes investment in infrastructure and workforce, but also scaling Africa-led platforms for coordination and innovation. It means promoting partnerships that are aligned with African priorities, not just external agendas. It requires better coordination so that investments are visible and complementary and strategic. The mechanisms that have been highlighted here are also critical, and Professor Brando mentioned them. We need approaches that are less exposed to political cycles. This includes earmarked revenues, innovation funds, pooled regional financing, and public-private co-investment models. These mechanisms provide more stability and allow countries to move from reactive funding to sustained investments. So what are the sources of funding and who has a role to play? Importantly, resources already exist, whether through natural resource revenues, pension funds, or the digital economy. There are opportunities to mobilize domestic financing. The issue again is not about availability, it is prioritization and alignment. And here we have an example of some of the actors who have a role to play in financing for R&D, such as governments, regional bodies, the private sector, partners. Now, I will give an example of an initiative that we are currently implementing in WHO Afro called the Preparedness Data Exchange. Data and analytics are becoming central on how we guide R&D. I want to take this opportunity to share some of the work that is ongoing at the WHO Regional Office for Africa, where we hope to generate important data to support epidemic and research preparedness. The Preparedness Data Exchange is Afro's regional epidemic data platform, integrating multiple data streams across all 47 member states in real time. It supports pathogen prioritization, trial readiness, and operational decision-making in research and development. What this allows is a more proactive approach, linking data, research, and action in a way that was not previously possible. So building on this, we're now seeing new applications of AI, from identifying priority pathogens to preparing trial sites to understanding community dynamics in real time. And these are not just theoretical tools, they are practical enablers of faster, more targeted research and response. On to my last slide. On core protocols, they present another important shift. They move us from ad hoc research towards prepared and multi-country trial platforms. These platforms allow for rapid activation and generation of comparable data across countries. The goal is also to support African-led research preparedness, which includes financing. In a nutshell, Africa's R&D challenge is not simply about funding, it's about systems. In order to manage future epidemics effectively, Africa must invest in and build its own research infrastructure, because ultimately, R&D is not just about generating evidence, it's about ownership, priorities, and the ability to act when it matters most. This requires coordination, coordinated action, governments institutionalizing financing, regional bodies to coordinate, research institutions to deliver, private sector to co-invest, and partners to play a catalytic role. In short, this is a shared responsibility. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Belize. I think that is a really important addition to this conversation. And I especially like that that punchline that you mentioned, that the problem with Africa's R&D, it's not simply about funding, but systems. Yes, there is a lot of dependency on external donors, but you then identify the imbalance in the distribution of the funds themselves. And the absence, which I think is also very critical to your conversation, the absence of systems to transform those fundings into real benefits for the African people. And I also like the fact that you mentioned that there are commitments made by different people to change the narrative about research and development in Africa. But what is also missing is also the absence of systems, again, to transform those commitments into reality. And your recommendation, I think it's quite timely and quite important that we need to build systems that are less exposed to political circles. A very important point. And in my mind, these points that you raised, Dr. Belize, raised a number of questions. But just before I get to the questions, and I would also encourage the distinguished attendees to please use the Q&A to pose your questions to our speakers. But I think right now I would like to turn to Professor Oyewale Tomori, who has been carefully listening to the speakers, and I'm imagine also taking notes to share with us what he makes of these contributions, and of course, he also share with us further insights that he may have. Prof, do you quite agree that the problem with R&D in Africa is not simply about funding, but systems? Prof. Oyewale, you are on mute if you are saying something. Could you unmute, please? Okay, good. Hello, Prof. Can you hear me, Prof?
Hello.
Yes, okay. We
Hello,
can
can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now. Please go ahead, Prof.
Oh, sorry about that. I think there was some little problem with yeah, I think I'm so excited by our two presenters, Professor Okolo and my dear sister Belize. You said it the way it should be said. You gave us the data required to tell us where we are. We have the largest problems, but we have the minimum resources put into solving those problems. I'm not going to go into all the data, you already have them, but I'm going to just point out a few very, very important issues that has come. And not only point out the problems, because that's always what we do. We give out all the issues, all the problems and all that, but then we don't really go beyond that one. It's like in Africa, we build capacity, but we don't prepare to retain the capacity that we build. So my friend from NEPAD, I think I'll just go straight to some of the fantastic suggestions they've made. The fact that Africa needs a legally binding commitment in terms of funding. You remember the Abuja Declaration is 25 years. It said two countries have consistently, but the data I have is that no country in Africa over the 25 years has consistently met 25%. Sometimes they meet it in 1 year, they meet it another year, they don't. Even Cape Verde, even South Africa. So that's a major problem, that ordinary declaration doesn't solve the problem. We need a legally binding agreement amongst ourselves to say, yeah, this is what we need for that one. The second point they raised was the fact that having a research endowment, that Africa puts our money where her mouth is. Get out together. Let's have some endowment contributed from different sources, private industries, whatever. We well laid out structures on how we're going to spend this endowment, how we can put that endowment into a place that will yield interest, and not just focus only on the interest to do the kind of research, provide the funding for the research that we're talking about. He talked about incentive. One of the greatest problems that we have, like I mentioned, that we build capacity in Africa, but we don't create the enabling environment for the capacity to remain in Africa. And so we are forever building capacity for other people to use, because the environment around them, they cannot utilize what they have learned. And so this incentive that he has mentioned is not just in terms of monetary incentive, it is incentive on the environment. That when you need a material, your electricity is working, your water is functioning, there's security, you can go to where that's the enabling environment we are talking. That's in the hand of our government, not in the hand of donors. And when you have that kind of security, the thing that made people of my generation to be able to wake up at 3 o'clock in the middle middle of the night. We go and check our result. That's part of the enabling environment. These are things you won't get, even daytime. You can't travel anywhere in Africa, in many of the African countries, because of issue of security. He talked about taking the advantage of the AI that we have now, the system. What I used to tell people that my generation will provide you diagnostic result 2 weeks after the person has died. So we are only telling the doctor, this is what killed your patient. This current generation, with what they are doing, they are using their own technique to say, look, we can give you a result within the next 3 or 4 hours or so, which means the doctor or the physician can do something about it. I see the next generation using the AI to actually predict and say, Mr. A, you're going to get that disease tomorrow, therefore let us prevent it for you from getting it, because they are bringing out all kinds of resources that they are bringing in. So that's where the issue of this thing. Yeah, we cannot do without aid for the time being, but aid must be restructured. And that's one of the things I like about what NEPAD has said. The fact is that the kind of aid we are getting. I used to say one thing, that when people talk about the benefit of AIDS, when you do the acronym of benefit of AIDS, it is BOA, which is BOA. And you know the boa snake is a constrictor. Aid is a constrictor. And until we get ourselves out of that, before we begin to see that we cannot be totally dependent on aid. And my dear sister also went on and talked about almost the same issues, but brought out in a different way. The political commitment, the political mandate that is given to our people, the human resources that we have, and the fact that Africa has enough resources. I mean, in the first study you did, one of the constraints was that corruption was the main. So the problem is that the fund is not there. So when people talk about the competing interest in Africa, we have to do maternal health, we have to do that. The competing interest in many African countries is corruption. And until we take legal of that one, all of the funds we put in will always go down the same line. And I was telling them, our leaders, they create an enabling environment for themselves to be able to lead us. They have the best cars, the best everything. We are saying the same thing. Create an enabling environment for your researchers, for your scientists, and then the return on investment you get from what they do will overcome. We will surpass the economy that the economy people are bringing up. They also mentioned the fact that the problem is not with whatever, is with the system. The system, something is wrong with us, the system that we are using. And these are some of the areas that you and I, we need to look into and see how do we make this thing. Again, I talk about capacity building, but we don't talk about capacity retention. Further on, some of the figures that are shown where we are. In the bad things of the bad, we have the highest percentage. In the good areas, we have the lowest percentages. They said we talk about commitment, but commitment of the politician is gas. Is only commitment at election campaign, but they don't implement, they don't follow it up with the resources. It's not that we don't have the resources, but the resources are being used for wrong projects. They have short political circles. They only want to see what can I do quickly before my time goes, before the next election comes. And so there's no long-term planning. But these problems we are talking about are basic problems and issues which we need to look at. There is also the point raised by Rosaline about finance disconnecting, the fractures financing, and which are short-term, which is not what you can use when you're making long-term plan for disease pandemic preparedness. We finally ended up by saying that resources exist, but we need to change our attitude. And how we're going to do that? We must continue to make use of what is available to us. The WHO is making an attempt on a new process where information will be available. Country can share information together for us to be prepared. Not one country having one thing or not the other, but amongst us we share the information. The systems are brought into situation, and then again she ended up by the problem is not capacity, but alignment of the capacity we have. So there's enough resources in this country, enough of our people that are around, if we only align them properly for this thing. So it's a poor system and with underfunding. And those are the two things that we need to address. Finally, I want to say to our colleagues who have come up with this idea, the problem is for us, it's not that we don't know what it is. Many of the information that are provided are there, we know. But what are we going to do to implement properly. It is to look back and then to concentrate the fact that this is our problem. Dependence on aid is not the solution. We have enough resources, to do what we want. And let me leave you with one last thing. I want to, every time we talk about aid and COVID and no vaccine coming to us, let us reverse the situation. Supposing it was Africa where all of us were dying of COVID. Supposing it was Africa that made the vaccine for the COVID. And then Europe, where they were not dying, comes to us and says, give me the vaccine. Or give me some vaccine. Will you give them? So let us look at that and consider our situation. Let us focus on the need of our people. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Prof. Thank you so much for those very useful insights. I quite appreciate that. And I also like the particular line which you, nearly ended with, which is that this is our problem. And it is also our responsibility to address this problem. And then I'm just going through the post, and I saw a particular comment that Shashi Kant also raised in the chat box. That time has come for Africa really to do away with the begging bowl stance and begin to start taking important steps to really reverse the situation and change the narrative on the continent. And I quite agree with you, Prof, a lot. I quite agree with many things you said right there, including the recommendations that you provided. And then just talking about the recommendations broadly, probably maybe I will start with Professor Brandon Okolo before I go to the Q&A to raise those questions that our attendees left in the chat box. I'm quite fascinated and impressed by the 4 pillars that Professor Brandon really introduced. And I just wanted to start with the first pillar, which is the legislative research minimum. And I guess legislative research minimum, I guess it means in our budgets, national budgets. The 2% really, I think that is quite fascinating. And I'm also curious to learn from you, Prof, whether besides legislating the research minimum, for example, could you also establish things like rules like take or pay rule that require any health organization or institution in Africa, including pharmaceutical companies, to take locally produced health products or pay a certain percentage into a dedicated research and development fund for importing health products. Could procurement, for example, also be turned into a funding mechanism for R&D in Africa? And how do we do that in a way that is not susceptible or exposed to political circles and pressures that Dr. Marie-Roselyn Belize mentioned in our own presentation? And besides besides dedicating or saving 2% in a dedicated research R&D fund, and besides the rule-based mechanisms for raising funds for R&D in Africa, I guess another important question, which is an extension of the question, Prof, that I want you to consider, is the governance of the fund itself. Who should be responsible for the governance of the funds, Prof? Maybe you can start with the first question, then move on to the, yeah.
Okay, I go to the first question where, you essentially want to know how do we get, or rather, should we have rules that imposes levies on people who do business around the health sector across our continent? I think so. I think levying big companies is important. It's been tried elsewhere. For instance, in Nigeria, they have a so-called local content program where without even negotiation, if you're a business and you decide to go into manufacturing, a certain amount of the input that goes into your manufacturing environment must be sourced locally. These are very standard things. And I also think politics has a role to play, in my opinion. The politicians, we should create a breed of politicians that have a full appreciation of the challenges that we face. This is important. We cannot separate politics from from healthcare. As far as I'm concerned, there's a correlation there, and we should make sure that the side of the equation that delivers the best result, that side of the equation is well groomed. In my opinion, our citizens as well. When we create citizens that understand and have a full appreciation of what we face as a collective, out of those citizens would develop politicians that would make rules and regulations and legislatures that favor the citizenry. It's as simple as that. There's a lot of work to be done, know that. But I just want to mention something before I go to your second question, which is that we should not forget the fact that a lot of progress has been made in Africa. I have to say this continent has done some very progressive things, and we should not take that for granted. We shouldn't. In 1960, we had no scientist almost that could do the kind of work which Dr. Marie-Rosalind is doing. Not just from a point of view of expertise, but also from a point of view of gender. But look at her today. She's an authority in the work she does. She's able to convince decision makers. She's able to defend her thoughts and her opinions. So a lot of progress has been made in our continent. Now to the second part of your question, which deals with, if you could remind me, sorry about that.
The governance of the R&D
exactly.
itself. Yeah.
So one thing is clear, in our continent, we do have financial institutions that come with the right credibility to be able to manage funds. They exist. Some of them, you'll be very surprised, associations within your small localities. We have credible human beings that can manage funds. Some of them are at the very continental institutional level, like the African Development Bank, without trying to, pitch for them in this case. But they have the expertise, they have the global credibility to take your funds, do with your funds what you've asked them to do with it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. And to Dr. Marie-Rosalind Belize, I do have a question too about the commitments that you alluded to during your presentation, and I think Professor Yewale also mentioned some of those commitments too. But the particular commitment that I'm thinking about is the commitment from politicians, and I just heard now from Professor Brando to also mention too that we cannot separate politicians or exclude politicians in whatever we are doing. Definitely, I also agree with that they have a role to play, certainly in this. But is it also possible that, because I see there is a lot of dependency on politicians around these issues, but if you think about the instruments that have been created, there is the Abuja agenda Abuja declaration that you mentioned, for example, or so there is also the Lusaka agenda too. And there is a lot of expectations that the politicians will do the right thing, right? Could that also be a problem that we are heaping so much on politicians, even though we cannot exclude them, but it seems so much is being placed on their shoulder? Could that be a problem, number one? And is a world where a mechanism for R&D funding in Africa that is not dependent on political goodwill possible?
Thank you so much. It's such an interesting question. Not long ago, I read a book that called The Political Determinant of Health. And most of the time, we are talking about the social determinant of health. We are talking about the cultural determinant of health, but we always forget the political determinant of health. And most of the time, you can see that determinant that we don't really want to consider is that one taking us back, because decision relies on politics. Policy relies on them. So we need to work better, I think. We need to make more advocacy in that determinant of health in order for them to understand the need. We need more advocacy with more evidence base, where we can really, I can say, show them the reason why of those policy, and show them that without research, how we cannot move a society forward. We cannot move, even though we need, for example, the good state of health. How can that policy help us? Because I would like to say yes, we have to put them apart, but I'm afraid that I'm lying to you. We need to work, I think we need to work better with them, because for research, we need it to be embedded. When you look at, for example, the budget of the country to be approved, it's a drafting by politicians, it's also approving by parliamentarians, and us in society, in civil society, or in our research in scientific, we apply what those people are approving. So now we have to work with them, to involve them more into, so that they can know better our needs. And when they are making those decisions on our behalf, so we make sure that they take care of that needs that they see with us. So we cannot work without a politician. Actually, we need to work, to involve them better and have them be part of that, because we need more policy research in Africa. I will not say countries, but there are a lot of countries where research doesn't even have a budget line in the national budget, In order to reverse that situation, we cannot do it alone. We need to work together with them. The scientific community will need to work together with them. Thank you. Over.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Belize. And also, sorry, I'm just reading your message now in the chat, but thank you. I've noted it. Prof. Brandon, I think I'm going to ask you a similar question, or the same question, the second question, especially. Is a world where we don't, is a world where, or is a mechanism for R&D funding in Africa that is not dependent on political goodwill possible? And how do we realize such world?
Well, can you hear me? Sorry.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, good. The private sector also has a very big role to play. We shouldn't forget them. There's a lot that the private sector could do without being captured by the whims of politics. And that aspect of driving R&D in health, we've not fully tapped into it. We should try to figure out and brainstorm over what kind of a mechanism can we put in place to trigger private sector full participation in health R&D. Having said that, I have to say that the environment under which the private sector could drive as aggressively as possible health research is, to a certain extent, created by politics. You need to keep that in mind. So, as Dr. Marie Roslin already mentioned, the politician, we make it sound as if they are a different breed of creatures. These are human beings like you and I. They are our neighbors, they are our brothers and sisters, our colleagues, our former, schoolmates. They are the ones that are these politicians we're talking about. And when you sit down with them and engage them the right way, we can get things to work in this continent. Advocacy has required a lot of it, and we shouldn't give up on advocacy. We shouldn't give up on the discussion and the conversation around all of this. I just want to end with one simple statement. In 1960, we had about 3% of STEM graduates from all African universities being female in 1960. In 2024, that number has gone up to 47% and is a global highest in our continent. It is the global highest. You would not find in any other continent where you have up to 47% STEM graduates being females. In fact, in Tunisia, where I was last week, that number goes up to almost 70% in STEM.
Wow.
Can you imagine? Now, but think about what drove that number from 1960 at 3% to 47% in 2024 as a global highest. It is policy. It is painstaking policy, consistent policy. It is, a mindset where the entire society opens up the door of STEM to females as well. And we can do that in whatever sphere of social living we want if we come together and give time a chance for that to materialize. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. I'm now just going to go to the Q&A now to read out some of the questions that our attendees have posted. So there is Yi Betal asking, thank you for organizing this time and important webinar on domestic health research financing in Africa. I'm joining from Ethiopia, where ongoing efforts are on the way to strengthen national health research priority setting, evidence-informed decision-making, implementation research, and broader health system reforms. While considerable progress has been made, which you also mentioned too, Professor Brandon, in defining national priorities and establishing governance structures, one of the major challenges remains sustainably sustainable financing and operationalizing these priorities within routine health system functions. I would therefore be grateful if the panel could reflect on the following question. How can African countries collectively move beyond fragmented and donor-dependent research financing towards sustainable domestic financing models that embed research, evidence synthesis, implementation learning, and knowledge translation into routine health sector programming and budgeting? Do you have any ideas? I think it also aligns with some of what you've said, Professor Brandon, already around the 4 pillars, but do you have specific insights on how this may be done within the context of Ethiopia? Prof. Brandon?
Was that a question for us?
Yes, it's a question for us. So for you.
It seems to be a string of questions, right?
Yeah. So I guess the quick question is, how can African countries collectively move beyond fragmented and donor-dependent research financing towards sustainable domestic financing models that embed research, evidence synthesis, implementation learning, and knowledge translation into routine health sector programming and budgeting? I think you already touched on that with the 4 pillars that you mentioned. But I think one thing that Gibraltar can benefit from will be as your specific recommendations for operationalizing those pillars within the context of Ethiopia.
Okay. Well, I'll start from the continental level, then I come to Ethiopian level.
Okay.
At the continental level, when you look at Africa's R&D landscape, it really is fragmented. It is fragmented. So one of the things that we started working on about 11 years ago was to set up a so-called Science Granting Council initiative. And the Science Granting Council initiative is a consortium of national councils from different African countries. Currently, we have about 20 African countries that are part of it. And over the last 11 years, the councils have been taught how to run a national council. Remember, these are the councils are the funding channel for R&D in the different countries. In South Africa is the NRF, the National Research Foundation. Okay. Now, they've been taught how to set up a council, how to manage a council, how to design calls, how to build a budget, and how to go around and mobilize funding for it. And we can do this also at the national level, where again, you have duplication of agencies. If you're able to get those agencies to work together as a consortium, the impact is a lot stronger and greater than if they work in silos. So for a country like Ethiopia, my appeal is to look at the R&D landscape and the funding landscape and see how are funds being channeled to different agencies, and if those agencies could be brought together to look at the commonalities around their mandates and work on those together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. I see that Dr. Marie Roslin is also attending. Okay, Dr. Marie Roslin, you're there with us. Excellent. So there is this second question, which I thought, I think the person can really benefit from your insights. So this is from Faith. I think governments view health research as a cost, not as a strategic investment in health security, economic growth, and sovereignty. How can we practically change this view? And also, what practical accountability mechanisms can ensure domestic research funding commitments are actually implemented beyond political declaration? So do you have any thoughts on how this will be done, Dr. Marie Roslin?
Yes, this is a very complex and long question. So I will answer some part and Prof. But I think most of the element of response I can share already be discussed on today. The Prof already highlighted, how can government don't see research as a cost. It is, I think, can say it is the same thing as health. Most of the time we see health as a cost, not an investment. So I think it is where we need that mentality shift. Okay, and it is our responsibility in the scientific environment with the Prof. Brando to bring, that change in the conception of research. Research is an investment, not a cost, as we are doing now for health. So in the health side, for example, in my area, what I'm doing now, I'm doing some economic studies in order to show how outbreaks, for example, are really economic burden of outbreak on the health system, not only on people. Most of the time also research, this is the same thing we need for research. What could be, when you not invest in research, what is the other side, but also when you invest in research, what is the return on investment that country will have? Because research is what we need to inform all policies that we have. We cannot have development without research. We cannot have healthy population without research. So how we put all those, in an economic I can say in an economic language, in a financing language, in order for politicians to understand. I can say that in the health sector, we are more or less coming to it, but it's a big, I can say, big challenge. It's a very long, I can say, work. So we are also working with the bank. For example, we're working with World Bank in order to change that, I can say, the way they invest in health. So it's the same. I think we need to do the same, for example, for researcher also. So what we can also do, I think we also need to work, I think the Prof said it too, more closely with those. We need to also have innovative, financing models. I was thinking, for example, when we are recommending in WHO side that member states should put more taxes like in soda, in sweet, sweet beverage, those kind of things. Part of that tax should be dedicated to research, because how do we go there? Africa is benefiting from research in other parts, okay, so in the global environment, but we can also do those research in Africa and inform other continents. You know what I mean? So when the member state is implementing those, we have to make sure that dedicated, part of that collected taxes are also dedicated to research in order to know this I can say decision can be reverted in 10 years. And to revert that decision, you need research in order to do it, because you cannot revert the decision without sustained research in all of them. When you look at, for example, cancer, we don't have a lot of research in cancer in Africa, while our women are dying with breast cancer. So we are benefiting from other sides, but maybe our race has a different, there are things that we can also discover and inform others. So I think secondly, also, we need to embed research more in health budget. This is all, but well, we are talking of research globally, but me, I'm more versed in research in health, but it's to make sure that every project that we are doing, this is what I'm doing now with countries, whatever the project that we are submitting to proposal, we are responding, I make sure there's a research component in it. Sometimes, we come with, donor will, but however, it's also important that we stop doing that change, smallly but surely, so we can make sure that everything we do, the research and component is embedded in it. And I think lastly, we also need Champions, I see, for example, Africa CDC, we have a lot of champions. We have local manufacturing champions. We have a cholera champions.
Yeah.
But we have all the champions, but we don't have yet a researcher champion. I think we also need more, advocacy in that sense to put research also as a area, as a domain that we cannot move without it. This is also something that we can do. And maybe also to make sure in all the declaration, political declaration, research is embedded in it. Sometimes we see declarations that are not really, they don't really consider that research part. So I think we have to make sure that everything, every single action, every single activity, every single project that we are doing, small, it can be small because sometimes the project are 6 months, 1 year, but we can do operational research also in those projects to inform others. So let me stop there because it is very long question and I can be going with the flow. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mary. Yeah, I mean, just valuable insights, definitely. And I'm just going to also raise this, I think, one final question that we can go on to the final remarks. So I guess this final question, which is from Daniela, I think also probably reflects some of the things, some of the discussions we had just before the webinar started, which is about the competing interests, right? I know you did mention those competing interests initially. Some of them include education, for example, social protection, security that Professor Oyewade also mentioned, and there are also infrastructural deficits. I mean, that's evident in many aspects of life in Africa. So Daniela's question really, I think you could consider it as stemming from that background, right? Because the question she's asking is it's about realism. So realistically, how much room do governments have to increase funding for health research, considering GDP growth, servicing debts, expenditures, and so another competing interests that they may have. So now we want governments to do these whole things. If you going back also to Professor Brando's first pillar, we want them to legislate a research minimum and stuff. But is it really realistic? Is this feasible? Is what we are proposing really feasible? What you are proposing, Dr. Marie Roslin, feasible? For Professor Brandon, I would also ask you the same question. Is what you are proposing realistic? But maybe Dr. Marie first, then Professor Brandon.
Yes, of course. Let's give the prof maker the summary of it. So I will say yes. If I have to reply with a single word, I will say totally yes for me. It is totally possible. So now, how to make it possible? This is the question that we have to reply. We know there, I think before we started the webinar, we are, having that discussion, starting with the competing priorities. It is how we start the discussion of the webinar. And the prof came with a very important aspect of the corruption, of the use of the resources, how the resources of the country are being really used. And I was also surprised in the Metimeter. Corruption was the word that stayed there. That means we all know where the problem could be. We all know where it is, So how now can we reverse that? So how can we now, even though we don't reverse it, but how can part of that can be redirected to research, So I think this is the big question for me. How can we convince, our politicians? How can we convince our representatives in order to make part of those funding that are using in things that can be not be totally, I can say, in the benefit of the population, that cannot be totally in the benefit of the communities? How can we decrease the money that we are investing in them and invest that in research? So other things also, I think it's important for us to see. So how can we work with parliamentarians? When we were, for example, in WHO side, trying to implement the international health regulation, it was a lot of, back here because it's depending on member state. So they need to understand how we protect, each other. Research should be as we consider it, Research is how tell us how should we move forward. I think every community we need to move forward. So how do we embed research in our life every day? So research should be a word that we also pronounce when we are pronouncing, oh, I'm going to a healthcare center. What other research has been done in order for me as a member of community to be protected of that disease? So we also need that part of the community to be aware of it. We also need that advocacy, not only at political level, but also at community level. How are we sensitize our community in order for them to know about research? I'm not sure we do scientific world, we did a great job in that. How do we involve civil society? Because they are the voice of the community in order to push politicians, to push parliamentarians in order to inform that. So let me give her the floor. I think we don't have a lot of time, so the prof, so
Yeah.
you can add on that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Marie-Roselyn. So let's over to you to Professor Brandon. Is the 4 pillars you are recommending, are they realistic? Can they be operationalized within the African context, for example?
Yeah, there were actually 5 pillars, just
5 pillars, sorry, 5 pillars,
for
yeah.
research sake.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think they are all, realizable. There's nothing impossible for us to do if we work together. Nothing is impossible for us. And I just want to reiterate one point. If we know the right thing to do, just as you saw from the Mentimeter,
Yes.
everybody agreed that corruption is a critical part of the shortfall that we have in research funding. If we all know what to do and resolve all together on doing that thing that needs to be done, it would happen. I don't know how else to put it. And it starts with education. And that's why I said once, remember these politicians that we talk about, the corrupt people we are talking about, we say it as if they come from a different planet. These are our neighbors. Some of them are our friends. Some of them we grew up with them. If the education that goes into grooming people to be good citizens is intensified, our societies will change. It might not change immediately, but we'll give it time. Remember, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. You give it time, within 20 years, you wouldn't recognize this continent if we did that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Brandt, and thank you to you, Dr. Marie-Roselyn Belize, for joining us. I think it's been a very useful and valuable session. We truly appreciate your insights and your expertise. We also thank you for also creating time to be with us. I see Dr. Marie-Roselyn is with us, but also she's also still busy with other things. So really, 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 really appreciate your sacrifices. So thank you so much for doing this, for being with us this afternoon. We also want to thank our esteemed attendees too for joining us. It's been a great session, and we really couldn't have done this without your presence. So thank you, everyone, and I wish you all a very lovely afternoon. So goodbye, everyone. So thank you, Professor Brando. Bye. Bye, everyone. Bye.